tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So as we discussed yesterday, the structural framework for where nonviolence fits in the path is as one of the wise intentions or right intentions, the second limb of the Noble Eightfold Path. So in the first limb of right or wise view, we attend to the deep conceptual and cultural frameworks that are the map for how we live in the world, right? Most of those are inherited and unconscious. We work to make them conscious, and those that are unwholesome, we work to shift in the direction of a more wholesome. And so taking on the reflection around the Four Noble Truths, the reflection on dependent origination, seeing how suffering arises as a result of grasping, all of this teaches the heart right view over time as we practice. And then right view, as it becomes more and more aligned with the Dharma, gives rise to the desire for liberation, the desire for freedom, samvega, the intense longing and urge for freedom. And wise intention manifests as, classically in the list, as these three types of thought or types of impulse that we can then cultivate, right? And these are renunciation, loving kindness, and nonviolence. So we're unbinding the ancient training in their opposites, right? The opposite of renunciation, the ancient training in greed, the ancient karma of greed, the opposite of loving kindness in hatred and ill will, and the opposite of non-harming in cruelty and intentionally harming. So uprooting those painful qualities, we cultivate the intention toward renunciation, love, and non-harming or non-violence. And then those are the seeds that then flower as action. The link between intention and action, classically, is that all volitional actions have an intention behind them. So intention and volition, I use a tiny bit differently because there are different words in Pali, sankappa and cetana. But you can think about volition as the impulse that immediately precedes a distinct action. So I have a volition to reach down and pick up the water glass. I have a volition to try to say a skillful sentence to you and make the words come out. Intention I use to think about a more systemic orientation to life. So I have an intention toward non-harming, and in any given moment, that might manifest as this or that, volitional action. But the intention is kind of the thought or the big narrative, the deeper story that I use to try to orient myself in a complex world. So the wise intentions are the seeds of the actions we call ethical or virtuous, sila. And so wise speech and wise action is expressed through keeping the precepts of not killing, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, not lying and using harsh speech, and not misusing intoxicants in ways that cause carelessness and could impel you to break the other precepts. And so to do these practices to restrain ourselves from causing harm and to actively cultivate the good qualities, we need volition to do that. You need some amount of will. And to fuel that will, you need to want something, like to be free from suffering. And so you can see how from view arises intention, from intention arises action, and from action arises the results of harm or non-harm in the world. and the various results of moving along in the path. Clarifying the heart and mind through practice is also the result of a virtuous volitional action. So when the Buddha talked about the relationship between intention and action, he uses the term kamma or karma, which was a common term in his culture broadly, and it's used very differently in different religious contexts. And the Buddha reframes it. There seems to have been, from the texts we can see, there was quite a debate around the relationship between intention and action, the importance of action, the importance of ethics, and the relationship between action and its fruits. This was the philosophical sort of ferment of the time. So there were some teachers who had a purely materialistic view that everything was just insentient atoms without feeling or soul, and therefore there was no such thing as harm. And they would give the example, if a sword passed through someone's neck, it's just some atoms passing between other atoms, and nothing is changed or destroyed because atoms are not changed or destroyed. So that was one philosophy. The Buddha rejected that as not helpful. There were other philosophies that said that our lives were completely deterministic, and that they unfolded directly from conditions leading to the next action, and we had absolutely no free will in this. There was no choice, and beings completed their karma and became liberated at some time in the future, and you had nothing to do with it. It would just happen when everything ripened to happen. And again, there's no self in that, but there's no choice. The Buddha rejected this as unskillful. There were many of these, and one of the Buddha's most successful and important competitors in this argument were the Jains, founded in the modern period, in the Buddha's time, by a sage named Mahavira, the Tirthankara, or the ford crosser. He was slightly elder to the Buddha and started his community a few years earlier. The Jains were the first spiritual community to ordain women. The Buddha was the second, and they stood out as being rare in that gesture. And Jain practice had much to recommend it. It was actually a very similar body of teachings to the Buddha, but they were competitors, and the Jains had a few particularly different views about action and their results that I think are instructive for us. One of the Jain views about causing harm was that if we cause harm through our actions, whether intentionally or unintentionally, we would bear the karmic results of that. And that's partly why Jain practitioners famously sweep the path in front of them as they walk to clear it of bugs that they might accidentally step on, or wear a white card in front of the mouth to in case a stray bug might fly in, to protect that bug, and brush off the seat before they sit down, lest they accidentally sit on an insect. And so this view, I think, is actually, in a certain way, a variation of it is really common on the progressive left right now, that holds that if you cause harm or discomfort to someone, whether you meant to or not, you're responsible for that impact. Right? We see this in the teaching on knowing the difference between intent and impact. And this is a helpful teaching. It arose particularly in relation to folks who hold social positions of privilege, being in uncomfortable conversations with folks of more marginalized castes or classes socially. And the privileged folks, this is really like an American progressive reaction against deluded white people, saying, but my intention was good. I didn't mean to hurt that person of color's feeling. My intention was good. And then the folks of color were like, that just doesn't quite cut it. Like you have to be responsible in some way to the impact you're causing. If you're just deluded, like you have to get educated. And so there's a kind of, like stumble on it once, forgiveness, but then after that you should know better. And but that kind of teaching, I think that was skillful, first of all, in the contemporary context. I think that led to a lot of privileged folks doing their work in good ways to understand the impact of unconscious bias. So I don't think that cancels out what the Buddha said, but what the Buddha said was a little different. That intention impact teaching, if we take it super literally, is a little bit more like the Jain teaching, that you are responsible for, and we could say you bear the karma of, an impact that's painful, even if you didn't mean it. The Buddha said, interestingly, that if that was how it worked, liberation would be impossible. Because another one of the theories that went along with that was that you have to clear the karma of every harm you've ever caused in the endless string of rebirths. You have to actually kind of purify that. And so some of those traditions, Jains and otherwise, had a very strong emphasis on ascetic practice and purification practice, with the idea that through causing the body pain and uncomfortable situations and extraordinary renunciations, deep fasting to the point of starvation, wearing no clothes at all, having no protection from the elements at all, never sitting down, that those kinds of ascetic practices burned up. The Sanskrit word is tapas for inner heat. They burned up the ancient defilements, the sanskaras. And so you had to burn those up and not create any new ones. So you're radically careful in your actions. And for the Jains, that's, and I don't want to oversimplify, and there are beautiful Jain practitioners. Still now it's a beautiful community. So I encourage you to read about the Jains and listen to their talks and get a more well-rounded view. But this is a simple snapshot of an aspect of Jain teaching that the Buddha, specifically in the Buddhist texts, really rejects. Because it shows up in the Buddhist texts, you could also understand that this is a little bit of a caricature of Jain practice, right? Because they were competitors. So understand that the Pali Canon is a bit propagandistic when it talks about the Jains. The Buddha always beats the Jains in argument, and converts their disciples and basically Mahavira is like, like those darn kids, Scooby-Doo, you've got me again. He's really painted in that kind of light, and of course that's in a certain way disrespectful. Like, this is one of the greatest spiritual leaders ever, and the Jain religion is still going strong. So just veneration to one's philosophical opponents and honor for their goodness in the world. But the Buddha rejected that particular aspect of the Jain teaching on karma, Kamma in Pali, karma in Sanskrit. The Buddha proposed something that, as far as scholars can tell, was an innovation that he brought to the conversation about intention and action. And that innovation was that Kamma, the inevitability of fruit coming back to the one who does the action based on the ethical valence of that action, that like if you cause harm, you're going to receive harm in some way, like you'll experience the pain of having done that. The Buddha asserted that this, first of all, doesn't mean that you have to clear everything from the past, right? All you have to do is come to clarity in the present and stop, achieve cessation, stop creating new Kamma, and then you're done. But almost more importantly, he said that liberation is possible because Kamma is only accrues to the actor if there is unwholesome intention. So if you accidentally step on a bug, it was an accident. And I think in a certain way this is very humane. It understands that in a complex world we are actually going to be complicit in all sorts of harm, whether we want to or not, and even if our intention is the opposite. And stepping on a bug is not exactly the same as supporting the militarized state through your taxes, so we don't need to elide those completely together. But the teaching is that the thing that gives rise to kamma actually is wrong intention. So it's not the act of taking life, but it's the intention to take life, or the intention to hurt, the cruelty itself. And that it's because of that that the Buddha would say that not all actions have a karmic result. It's not like every single thing you do through the day is going to bear karmic fruit someday. The things that really bear karmic fruit, that matter on the path to liberation, are actions with a strong ethical or unethical valence. And that's going to mean that they have a strong ethical or unethical intention behind them. So keeping that in mind then, that everything hinges on intention in terms of karma, in terms of how the impact of our actions will be felt by us later on. It's still the case that if we act in a way to harm others, we have to be accountable to that. And there's the sense in the teachings on the precepts, not just that, I think this is partly why the precepts are at the very beginning of the path, because it's almost like as soon as you hear about these things, as soon as you hear that ethics is the beginning of the path to liberation, and the path to liberation is intimately involved with being nonviolent and not creating unwholesome karma for the future, that you will immediately not want to create any more unwholesome karma. And the way to do that is to keep the precepts. So you put them at the very beginning of the path. So you're not wasting any time, getting philosophical or deepening in samadhi. The very first thing you do is, stop taking life, stop stealing, stop misusing sexuality and words and intoxicants. And you kind of get straight, with this relational situation, right? And only then do you start to feel safe enough in the world to enter deeper layers of purification and the path, like deeper meditation. So then we have the principle of nonviolence, the principle of karma, kamma, and how it's hinged to intention. And then we have the complicated world as it is, where we are embedded in systems that are violent through and through, and our participation in them is, we don't intend to support that violence. We might even actively resist it, but even actively resisting it isn't a black and white, zero-sum thing. Like, you can be a full-time peace activist and still decide that it's more skillful for you and, taking care of your family, or, not ending up in jail or whatever, to pay your taxes. Or maybe you decide to do one of those tax maneuvers that, when I was first around, nonviolent resistors, a lot of folks were doing this using publicly published, statistics on what percentage of the federal budget goes to the military, subtracting that percentage from their tax bill, sending in the remainder, because I feel fine supporting, Social Security and, food stamps and, paving the roads and things like that. And then you just send a note in to the IRS being like, I took out the 47.5% of the budget that's going to the military. And, so that's a statement worth doing perhaps. And you have to weigh all of the impacts, right? And, that's an intentional action. So you do that with willingness to, experience the consequences just as much as you do if you step over the police line and you decide to get arrested with your friends. I remember one action in San Francisco against the Iraq War. This was, we did a bunch of actions trying to prevent the United States from invading Iraq. I suppose this is 2002, something like that. In one of them, I got arrested with Jack Kornfield and and a bunch of other religious folks. That was, a feather in the cap to get arrested along with those fine folks. And at a different one, I was there, and a bunch of my friends were already kind of linked arms in front of the door to, it was like a big banking corporation downtown or something that was like funding something. The police moved in and started making the line around, and they did the sort of like, anyone on that side of the line gets arrested, anyone out here does not. And I got to just sort of coolly in my mind be like, okay, it's about 2. I don't actually have any appointments for the rest of the day. I have I have my ID on me. I've drunk enough water. Nobody's expecting me. Cool, let's do it. And just like stepped over the line and joined the folks. And another time I would be like, oh dear, I have to go teach a lesson. I taught piano lessons at the time for my living. I have to go teach a lesson. I'm not going to do it. Disappoint my student. So you're making a choice to receive the results of your actions. So we live in a complex system, and there's no easy Buddhist teaching that solves the problem of complicity. Even if you became a monastic, the monastics still participate in the insurance marketplace. They still, participate in the marketplace of taxes. Like I said, I was a piano teacher, and one of my students was a vice president at the financial firm Bear Stearns, and I was his piano teacher through the financial crisis. So I came over to his house. I actually called him up the day after Bear Stearns imploded and destroyed the world economy in one night. And I called him up, and I was like, I imagine you're a bit busy. Do you want a piano lesson? And he said, at this point, it doesn't matter, man. Just come on over. And he was he had a Harley Davidson. He was a kind of young boomer biker dude, very much of a dude. He wanted to play the piano so that he could play like I don't even know what he was playing, like Crosby, Stills and Nash tunes and worse. But a fine gentleman. And I came over, and I was like, Doug, man, how are you doing? And he said, dude, I lost $2.5 million in 20 minutes last night. And I was like, sorry. And I haven't been charging you enough, but anyway, so, oh darn, why did I mention him? That was just a funny story, but it had a point. That at one point I was thinking about where I worked with him for years, and at some point I was like, I know where this money comes from. That he works for Bear Stearns. I mean, this is like blood money, if anything was. And I wondered, like, okay, I'm participating, and this guy like pays me this money that he earns doing the stuff that he does, which is, I don't know enough about it to say that it's categorically wholesome or unwholesome, but some parts of it felt like blood money at times. And the reflection was, what's my karma in this? What's my role in this? And I ended up deciding that I was a relatively wholesome purchase for him, and that I could let it go and not worry about it. But it points to this thing that, the question came up about around what's our role in relation to participating in violent systems? And so do we have a responsibility? If we have a personal vow toward nonviolence, do we have a responsibility toward a public expression of that vow as resistance, for instance? And I think I don't see anything in the Buddha's teachings directly that say that we have a responsibility for resistance, partly because there's a very strong, almost like anarchic thread that runs through the Dharma that really lets people make their own choices. There's not a lot of social prescription in the Buddhist teachings. There's suggestions that are, around ethics, like around treating, being good in your various relationships. But the Buddha didn't live in a culture where ordinary people, even high up aristocrats and priests, really changed the social order. The Buddha said that, the best government is a benign, enlightened monarch, essentially, who governs nonviolently and fairly socialistically, like essentially distributes the wealth so everyone is happy and the country is safe. It was a time of developing monarchies. It wasn't yet a time of developing democracies. And so there's not the concept in the Buddha's in texts that I know of, that talks about protesting or, saying out loud that you disagree with something in the government. What the Buddha did was he created an alternate society in the form of the Sangha, where if you disagreed, for instance, with the caste system, you could step outside of it by joining the Buddhist Sangha, by becoming ordained, and therefore losing your caste. And this became a social action. This became a justice action in the mid-20th century under the amazing Dalit or untouchable caste politician in India, Ambedkar. And the Ambedkarites were famous for resisting the caste system, resisting capitalism and militarism as well, and in a huge, not just symbolic, but kind of like culture-changing radical action. Ambedkar converted to Buddhism along with like 500,000 of his followers, who were all of the untouchable or Dalit caste in India. Converting immediately took them out of the caste system, because you only have a caste if you're Hindu. And so by converting, they suddenly had all of these legal rights that they didn't have as Dalits, because Buddhists were outside the caste system. And so they were not discriminated against in employment and other places the way that Hindus under the caste system were. And so Ambedkar used the Buddha's rejection of caste, not just for monastics, but as a gesture for lay people to radically change their social location by converting. And so there's nothing in the Buddhist teachings directly that says we have a responsibility to resist. But I think in the modern context, especially with so few folks in the West choosing or even being able to choose the path of being a monastic, as lay people, we have the possibility of bringing into our practice a kind of nonviolent intent that can change the way that we participate in harmful systems. So, I think of things like, their individual lifestyle changes, like becoming vegetarian, just non-participation in the meat economy. That doesn't destroy the meat economy. Like, the meat economy is doing fine without my business. I don't have that much leverage on it, and I think part of the challenge here is that as individuals we have very little leverage in the global economic systems, and even as large communities we have very little leverage. I've heard some Dharma teachers, say in a way that's completely diluted around how activist movements actually work, say things like, like, we just need 1 billion of us who believe in peace. to all together not participate, and the system will crumble. And to just be like, well, maybe, but like, okay, become an organizer. Like 1 billion people don't just suddenly appear in the streets, or change their eating or spending habits without organization, So I think that we can feel into a kind of responsibility to be engaged in whatever way we can find traction. And that's still going to require the cultivation of a pretty vast equanimity, knowing how little we can substantively change in the short term. I think it's really important to not lose right view here, though, where right view understands that greed, hatred, and delusion are inexhaustible, and that there's the visions of success held in an engagement system. I want to change this or that about the culture around me. That those are always going to be temporary. That to believe that social change is part of a trajectory toward better and better righteousness that doesn't ever get lost, right? That something can be gained and not lost, runs right into the teaching on impermanence and emptiness, and isn't particularly historically justifiable. There's some sense that there's been some amount of progress over the last 10,000 years for humans, but ethically and morally speaking, I've heard arguments both ways, honestly. That it's just as bad as ever. We just have better weapons and better protection, so fewer people die. I don't know. But I think the practice is to be balanced around what our expectations are, what our hopes are, where we feel like we can have leverage for action. So a couple more pieces. We're right at 9 o'clock. So blessings and good night to anyone. I'll go on for another couple minutes and then make a little space for questions. So that's one piece, is a kind of having perspective around the situation that we're in and how we might participate. I'm going to talk a little tiny bit here about the defense or protection or the just war. And the brief response that really just keeps coming to me when I reflect on this is that even if theoretically I could work myself around to the idea that causing violence to protect some people or beings is an appropriate response, I suspect that it would be very difficult for me to find the certainty, the freedom from doubt that I was really doing the right thing. Like, conditions are so complex. I might convince myself that, if there was somebody shooting up a school or a temple, that if I had a gun and was there, I would be able to do the right thing. But in the real world, first of all, that almost never happens, even when there are folks there with guns, and we just don't know. If I thought like, by like the American argument for bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that more lives were saved by doing that, because it stopped the war from being a brutal island to island and then land invasion of Japan. And maybe that's true. And if those were the only two options, then that's a very, very painful situation. But of course, those are never the only two options. I've heard some discussion of the folks on the, some folks on the American left finding, substantial empathy for the suffering, so much empathy for the suffering of the Palestinians that they understand the Hamas attack on October 7th as a kind of justified, breaking out of a prison, or a justified explosion following 50 years of oppression. The 50 years of oppression is real. But can we be so certain that a violent response is the only way that could prevent further pain and oppression? I heard one commentator say, there's been an Arab peace plan fully written out for many, many years. What if every Saturday, hundreds and hundreds of people in the West Bank and Gaza, calmly and nonviolently, held vigil at the border, holding up copies of the Arab peace plan. Like, we are willing to make peace. We'll figure it out, I can't know whether the violent response, was the best way to defend a group of people or to protect the children. And so I think that holding, this humility of really not knowing, it just makes it very difficult to justify that, the just war or the action in self-defense, that it's the only way. I don't think we can ever know that it's the only way. There's always another way. And maybe there's moments when you're completely against a wall and you can't see another way. And maybe there's no other way available to you and your powers and your positionality in that moment. And that's a terrible place to be in. So I have no easy answer to that. But because the simile of the saw was mentioned, we'll end with it. This is Majjhima Nikaya 21. And so interestingly, it follows the discourses on working with difficult thoughts that we've been looking at in the Sutta study class. It follows immediately after the sutta on the 5 methods for removal of distracting thoughts. And I think the backstory is important because the Buddha gives a teaching that essentially says, here's the famous quote, "Even if violent bandits were to sever you limb from limb with a 2-handed saw, still you should maintain a mind of loving kindness toward them." Okay. So, one, does that really mean that you didn't defend yourself or try to run away or try to get help before you got into that dire situation? Part of how I read that is, once the bandits are holding your limbs and they're about to cut them off, your options are pretty much done, right? And so once your options are done, I don't see any reason why anything other than a mind of loving kindness is helpful. I don't see why holding a mind of loving kindness toward them precludes screaming or running or, doing some non-lethal kind of kicking back, calling on the nature spirits. Maybe you did all that and they're still about to sever you limb from limb with a 2-handled saw. All right. Now, looking at the actual text, what we see is the context for this is not that anyone was getting dismembered. The context for it is that there was a rude monk who was kind of bad-mouthing people because he thought they were insulting him. He was thin-skinned and he couldn't take criticism. And so he was being inappropriate and unkind. And that the worst thing that was happening to him was that some people were telling him that he had some things to work on. So he was fragile. And the Buddha called him over and said, listen, that's not the right response to being called out. You have to maintain a mind of loving kindness, even if bandits were severing you, limb from limb with a 2-handled saw. And part of how I read it is like, the Buddha's like, and the Buddha's a compassionate guy. He was like, I know it feels like that. You're being called out or called in, you're getting some feedback. But really, man, first of all, they're not severing you limb from limb. And even if they were, the right response would be a mind of loving kindness. So I think that's appropriate, partly just because he wasn't speaking to a concrete, dismemberment situation. But it points to the radicalness of the practice of nonviolence that we'll close with remember the bit about intention and action creating karma. It's intentions that create your future births. And so if it's your intentions, wholesome or unwholesome, that create your future births and the possibility for practicing toward liberation, then it's far more important for your own well-being to maintain wholesome states of mind than it is to keep this body safe in the present moment. And that one I don't pull out as an argument much in non-Buddhist circles, because it requires some, at least, provisional acceptance of the teaching on rebirth, right? All of these ideas about how important it is to protect bodies are different if you're in, a Christian theology where you have one human birth and then one heavenly or hellish birth, and that's it. How you hold the importance of this one body, right? This one wild and precious life. Mary Oliver was Christian. One wild and precious life, You translate the poem into a Buddhist theology, and I could say, what is it you plan to do with an infinite series of wild and precious lives? With this one wild and precious life in an endless string of wild and precious lives that have, been marked by suffering and beauty, just like this one. And this is one of the best of them, because you're in contact with the Dhamma and you can practice and your heart is good and you're not, in torment. So just the profound importance of not just the actions of nonviolence, but the mind of nonviolence. And maybe to close, I keep trying to close here, but there you go. Maybe this actually means that, and I would not use this as a justification for violence, but that the mind of nonviolence is the important thing. And this touches into the okay, I'm holding the mind of nonviolence, but I'm going to do something that might have some impact, Near the end of the Buddha's life, the Buddha's cousin Devadatta tried to kill him, and the Buddha insulted Devadatta, and very famously, and Devadatta doesn't seem to provoke it in the text, and the Buddha says, essentially like you are of no worth at all, you miserable lick spittle. That's the translation, and Devadatta gets his feelings hurt, and some other ascetics hear about this. And one of them says, this shows that the Buddha is not enlightened, because an enlightened being would not do something to hurt another being intentionally. But the Buddha insulted Devadatta and hurt his feelings. And they go to the Buddha and they argue with him. They say, how could you do that knowing that it would hurt his feelings? Aren't you the infinitely ethical one? And the Buddha essentially says that conditions matter, and that the intention matters. So maybe I'll leave us with the possibility, the mystery that the mind of loving kindness and the mind of nonviolence, the mind of letting go and renunciation, is the thing that creates the future for you, and that your actions then can be an appropriate response to the conditions that you're in, and don't have to give rise to hatred or greed or cruelty, even as we take what actions are necessary or that we find are necessary to just to do the best we can to care for beings in a violent, interwoven world. All right, so that's it's really the end of our time for talking, so I have to stop. That's a good bookmark anyway. We'll pick this up more. We can keep going as long as we want. But thank you for your wise and warm attention.